What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Thanksgiving tables have a way of bringing out the best and worst in people, and in my family, it always leaned toward the worst. The turkey wasn't even carved yet when my mother, with that polished smile she wears for guests, leaned back in her chair and announced loudly, "Your brother has his own home now." Isn't that something? When will you finally get serious, Emily? Her voice carried across the table, just loud enough to ensure that every relative, every family friend, and even the poor neighbor who had nowhere else to spend the holiday, could hear the reminder of where she believed I stood in life. I felt all eyes turned toward me, as if I had been called out by a schoolteacher for failing an assignment. But instead of fumbling for an excuse, I let a pause stretch long enough to feel uncomfortable, and then I answered, calmly, without a single tremor in my voice, "I bought mine last year. I just didn't invite the skeptics." The silence that followed could have swallowed the room. I watched as my mother's fork slipped from her hand and clattered against the china, the metallic sound ringing louder than her words ever had. My brother, Daniel, who had been smirking smugly just moments before, froze with his glass of wine halfway to his mouth, his eyebrows raised like he had seen a ghost. The cousins looked down, pretending to be fascinated by the sweet potatoes, while my father shifted in his seat, clearing his throat, the sound rasping like gravel. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't laugh, I didn't explain, I just folded my napkin across my lap and cut into my food like I had dropped nothing more than a casual observation about the weather. But inside me, the quiet satisfaction burned hotter than the candles on the table. That dinner wasn't the first time they had tried to make me feel small, but it was the first time I didn't let them enjoy the moment. My mother had perfected the art of disguising judgment as encouragement, of turning every family gathering into an opportunity to remind me how far behind I was. She had done it at birthdays, she had done it at weddings, she had even done it when I graduated college. Daniel, who hadn't even bothered finishing his degree, was the one paraded around like the family's shining star. He landed a job at the bank, got a mortgage with my father's signature co-signed beneath his, and suddenly it was as though he had discovered electricity. Every achievement of mine, no matter how hard fought, was reduced to a footnote. But that Thanksgiving, I sat across from them, the smell of roasted turkey and spiced pie filling the air, and I refused to shrink into the chair like I had so many times before. I thought back to the countless conversations over the years when my father would shake his head with mock concern, asking when I was going to stop, wasting time, or the times my mother had tilted her head with a condescending smile, wondering when I'd finally grow up. They thought their constant doubt would push me into line, but instead it had sharpened me, made me deliberate with my choices, and taught me that sometimes the sweetest victories are the ones you don't announce until the silence is unavoidable. As the pause at the table stretched on, I caught Daniel's eyes flick toward my mother as if begging her to recover the moment, but even she looked rattled. The fork was still resting by her plate, untouched, as though she didn't know whether to pick it up or leave it as a testament to the silence I had created. The air in the room had changed, heavier, thicker, like everyone was waiting for me to keep talking, to explain myself, to soften the blow with a nervous laugh or an apology. But I let them wait. I let them sit with the discomfort the way I had sat through their countless jabs and humiliations. For the first time in years, it wasn't me who felt small, it was them. And while I didn't smile on the outside, inside I was grinning at the thought that this moment, this fork hitting the plate, was just the beginning. They thought they knew me, thought they could keep drawing the same script year after year where I played the underachiever and Daniel played the star. But what they didn't know is that I had been writing my own script quietly, patiently, and with far more precision than they ever gave me credit for. Buying that house wasn't just a financial step, it was my declaration of independence, a victory I had chosen not to share because I knew the truth. Some people only clap when it's their favorite actor on stage, and for them, it was never going to be me. That night, as I sat at the table surrounded by dishes of food I could barely taste through the adrenaline in my chest, I realized the power of silence. I didn't need their applause, I didn't need their validation, and I certainly didn't need to prove myself with explanations. All I needed was that one line, dropped in the middle of their carefully orchestrated performance, to remind them that the roles had shifted. They could keep their smug smiles and their whispered comparisons. I had something better. The truth, delivered with the kind of timing that left them speechless. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly suspect in that moment, was that I had more than one card tucked away. That Thanksgiving wasn't just about shutting them up, it was about setting the stage for everything that came after. And if they thought a silent table was uncomfortable, they hadn't yet seen what I had prepared for the rest of the year. I used to think favoritism was something you could outgrow if you worked hard enough, if you learned to laugh at the small humiliations and kept your head down long enough to make yourself undeniable. But the truth is that in my family, the old pecking order traveled like a family heirloom from one holiday to the next, wrapped in the language of concern and practicality and expectations. And by the time we reached that Thanksgiving, it had been rehearsed for years, starting with school concerts, where Daniel could miss half the notes on a saxophone my father bought with a flourish, while I played piano with both hands and a disciplined back, and still got told that talent was lovely, but stability mattered more. Moving into high school, where my mother called the counselor to ask about scholarship options for him because he was so gifted, while I pieced together part-time work and night classes because I did not want to take on debt we could not afford. And then drifting into adulthood, where every small misstep of mine became a proof point that I wasn't serious, and every stumble of his became a charming anecdote about resilience that apparently made him more lovable the more expensive it became. I can still list the milestones they celebrated on his behalf as if they were my own. The internship that appeared because a golfing buddy needed a warm body and a last name he recognized. The first car that was suddenly a family effort. Even though the family in that sentence mostly meant my mother refinancing a line of credit and my father driving to the dealership to sign, as if he were negotiating the Louisiana Purchase, while I stood off to the side and watched the sales manager beam as if the papers conferred knighthood, and then the apartment that evolved within months into a mortgage because rates were just too good to pass up. With my father co-signing and my mother staging the photos for a social media post where Daniel held a novelty key and a craft beer while I held the camera, and the ladder and the silence that comes when you realize you have been assigned support staff in a play where you once auditioned for the lead. I learned to stop sharing wins because wins were either belittled or claimed by the group. The way my promotion at a company that barely knew my last name until I outperformed 2 entire teams was converted into a casual aside in the family group chat, sandwiched between a casserole recipe and a photo of Daniel's new grill, and the way I was told, with kindness so polished it cut, that I should not get too comfortable because corporate jobs vanish and a husband would be a better plan than a title no one can explain at a block party. So I built a private life with the kind of patience you only acquire after being told you are impatient. I learned to love long walks and quiet grocery runs at dawn and the satisfaction of watching a savings account grow in slow, steady increments. And I taught myself to keep the best parts of my progress off the table where people who hadn't earned it would carve it into thin slices and hand it out with unsolicited advice. The part no one outside the house saw was how the script kept running even when the holiday lights were packed away, because favoritism has a monthly billing cycle just like everything else. I was the one who took my mother to physical therapy after she slipped on the driveway, while Daniel texted to ask if the therapist took his insurance and whether I could submit the paperwork for him. I was the one who sat with my father through an outpatient procedure and pretended the waiting room coffee tasted like something other than burnt plastic, while Daniel posted a photo of his meal prep with a caption about discipline. And I was the one who renewed the streaming plan and the family phone plan and the antivirus subscription, because it was easier to keep the shared accounts tidy than to teach adults who considered themselves endlessly savvy how to find a password manager. Over time, those small kindnesses accumulated into a quiet ledger that did not make me a saint, it simply made me fluent in the language of who actually holds the house together and who gets the credit for standing in the doorway. So when my mother's fork hit the plate and the room fell into that heavy silence after my line, the kind of silence that makes everyone check their posture without meaning to, I did not lecture or gloat. I simply reached into the pocket of consequences I had been sewing for months and pulled the smallest thread, one that felt gentle enough to pass for housekeeping yet pointed enough to send a message, because I had scheduled changes on the accounts I paid. Changes that did not punish anyone. beyond a mild inconvenience, yet carried the unmistakable shape of a boundary. And at 8 that evening, as the football game moved into a commercial break and Daniel reached for the remote to cue a movie he had been dying to show off on the new television, the screen delivered an error about a subscription that no longer recognized his profile, and at 8:15, while my mother attempted to FaceTime her sister to debrief the dinner, the family plan prompted a reauthentication it did not receive because my name and my card were headed somewhere else, and at 8:30, while my father stood at the kitchen counter filling a glass with ice, a friendly email landed in the group inbox explaining that shared services were being streamlined and that ongoing access would require a small contribution or a new owner. It was not a scream, it was not a spectacle, it was simply a tap on the glass from the woman they had called unserious for years, a reminder that the invisible work comes with an off switch. And as the evening dissolved into polite questions and thinly veiled irritation, I smiled into my napkin and offered a neutral solution about separate accounts, because adults should manage what they use. And I watched the lesson settle like a snowfall that keeps you inside just long enough to reconsider your plans, while in the back of my mind the real revelation waited, the one involving keys and deeds and a guest list that did not include people who clap only when the camera is on them. A revelation that would make the silence after a dropped fork sound like applause in comparison. The night after Thanksgiving, I drove home along the familiar route that passes the strip mall with the always broken neon sign and the church that changes its messages every Monday, and when the traffic thinned and the radio fell into that soft late-night murmur, I let the will guide me to the quiet street where the porch lights glow like patient sentries and the maples throw lacework shadows across driveways, and as I turned into my own I felt the same rush I have felt since the first evening. I slid the key into the lock, the same complicated blend of pride, stubborn relief, and an almost defiant peace that comes from building something while the chorus keeps insisting you cannot. And even as the taste of cranberry and tension still sat on my tongue, I found myself walking room to room as if to count the choices I had made when no one else was watching. The longish table I assembled by myself with a manual that assumed a helpful second pair of hands, the patched section of plaster behind the bookcase where I learned, after a messy afternoon, that walls forgive careful beginners, the mismatched mugs that look like a thrift store accident but fit perfectly in my palms on cold mornings, and the guest room that smells faintly of fresh pine because I convinced the manager at the hardware store to cut a board again and again until the shelf fit exactly the way I had drafted it on graph paper. I did not buy this house because I needed to prove anything to them, though I would not be human if I pretended that their doubt had not become a kind of fuel. I bought it because renting had taught me that I wanted a door whose dings and layers of paint belonged to me, a garden strip where I could plant lavender and see it return each spring, a hallway that echoed with my footsteps and not the neighbors' arguments, and a mortgage I could meet without bargaining my future to someone else's signature. And yet even the act of getting here was built from the kind of unphotogenic persistence that never earns applause at holiday tables. The months of pulling double shifts because I preferred cash in an emergency fund to a weekend flight I could post about, the evenings spent learning credit ratios that sound like algebra and feel like chess, the first meeting with a lender who tilted his head and asked, with the kind of politeness that carries a shrug, whether I had a partner to add to the application, followed by the second meeting with a different lender who did not ask that question and instead asked for documents, which I provided in a thick, labeled packet that impressed only me. There were mornings when the dream felt like a fragile glass I carried through a crowded room, because inspections revealed small problems that wanted attention, and the appraiser, friendly but brisk, returned a number slightly below what I hoped, and my real estate agent, a woman with tired eyes and a coffee thermos the size of a flower vase, told me that patience is the least glamorous skill in home buying and the most necessary, so I learned to sit on my hands and let the offer breathe, and then I learned to counter without sounding desperate, and eventually I learned that the word clear in an email subject line can make you cry in your car because it means more than approval. It means that the labyrinth you have been walking actually has an exit. I kept the closing to myself, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation, because I understood that certain audiences only know how to treat beginnings like arguments and victories like invitations for critique. And I gave my celebration the shape of a quiet evening with takeout and a new set of sheets that did not match the duvet. And then I spent the next week earning the slow confidence of the space by fixing the hinge that squealed and bleeding the radiators and learning that one window likes to stick in wet weather, and as the rooms began to sound like mine, I began to imagine all the ways I could protect this piece, which is how I decided that when the day finally came to let others in, I would open the door to people who had wanted me to have a door long before I found one. Because revenge, as I keep discovering, does not always require a sword. Sometimes it requires a form and a deadline and an invitation addressed with a calm hand. So on the Friday after Thanksgiving, when most people were hunting for televisions and kitchen gadgets, I sat at my desk and drafted a simple note that I would send in the evening. A note that read like a celebration, but functioned like a mirror. A note that said I would be hosting a small dinner before the new year to toast quiet milestones and that I would love to include the recipients, and below the RSVP button I placed 3 questions that did not look like traps yet were impossible to answer without hearing your own tone. One asked whether, in the last year, you had publicly undermined a family member under the guise of concern. One asked whether you had celebrated something that cost someone else invisible labor, and one asked whether you were willing to attend a dinner where the location would be shared only. After those questions were answered honestly, and the guest agreed to leave all jokes about timelines and seriousness at the door. I sent the note to friends who would smile and hit yes without rereading, and I sent it to relatives who would bristle and pretend they were confused, and I sent it to my parents and to Daniel with a subject line so ordinary it could not be accused of drama. And then I set my phone on the counter and stirred a pot of soup, listening to the spoon ring against the sides while the first replies arrived like weather alerts. Within minutes, my closest friend wrote that she was bringing the good bread and a story to make us laugh. Within an hour, a cousin who has always been kinder than the rest asked whether she could help with the chairs, and just before 9 in the evening Daniel sent a message that managed, in 3 long sentences, to suggest that my questions were unfair, my secrecy was immature, and my dinner sounded like a performance review he would prefer to skip, which I took as confirmation that the invitation had landed exactly where it needed to land. By the time I turned off the stove and washed the spoon, the responses from my parents had not yet arrived, and I did not pace or prod. I simply printed 2 place cards, wrote my own name on one and the name of the person I still hoped they could become on the other, and placed them side by side on the table as a reminder that a seat is something you offer, not something you owe. And while the printer cooled, I slid my keyring back into my pocket and whispered a promise to the house that the first time my family crossed its threshold would not be because they demanded a tour, but because they earned one. And as the porch light clicked on with its slow warm bloom, I realized that my small questionnaire had already done what speeches never could by turning the usual interrogation around, and that whether or not they chose to answer, the next move was no longer theirs. The first reply from my parents arrived on Saturday morning, hidden inside a message that tried to sound breezy but wore the heavy perfume of strategy. A paragraph from my mother about how she loved the idea of celebrating quiet milestones, as long as I could be reasonable about the location, because family should not have to jump through hoops to be included, followed by a tidy note from my father asking whether I had considered that older guests might need clarity for transportation, and although neither one touched the questions I had placed below the RSVP, they both circled them with the kind of practiced politeness that assumes the host will blink first, which I did not, because I had not written those lines to collect confessions so much as to make them hear their own echoes. By early afternoon, my phone hummed again, this time with Daniel's second salvo, a message that stretched into a rant about how my secrecy was becoming theatrical and how our parents did not deserve to be treated like applicants to a club, all of which concluded with an offer to swing by and pick you up, so he could drive me to my own event, as if the distance between us were a simple misunderstanding and not a house built brick by brick from a decade of condescension. I answered each note with a single long sentence crafted to sound like warm granite, thanking them for their interest, gently restating that the dinner would be intimate and that the address would be shared with confirmed guests on the day of the event, and reminding them that the 3 questions were not a trap but a courtesy that ensured we would share a table without old scripts stealing all the oxygen. And then I set the phone face down and walked through the house, measuring spaces and light the way a stage manager measures cues, because the evening I was planning would be small enough to feel deliberate and structured enough to feel unflappable. With a table that could stretch to hold a circle of people who had learned how to clap without demanding a spotlight, a playlist that stayed quiet enough to let honesty rise without the usual interruptions, and a front door whose lock had been rekeyed to a code only I could change in case anyone arrived with the idea that showing up uninvited counted as proof of love. On Tuesday, my mother called instead of writing, and in a voice polished to the point of transparency, she told me that she and my father had discussed the questionnaire and decided that it was unfair to paint the past in harsh colors when the family had simply tried to motivate me. Then she brightened as if an idea had just occurred to her and suggested we meet for coffee so I could tell her the new address privately, assuring me that she would keep it to herself, which made me smile even as it tugged at something old and tired, because I knew the promise would last exactly as long as the first curious cousin or neighbor pressed for details. I declined with gratitude and repeated the plan. And when she sighed the way people sigh when you cancel on a charity gala, I asked, without raising my voice, whether she had read the first question slowly enough to hear it, whether she could imagine what an apology would feel like if it were spoken without a single excuse, and the silence that followed was clean and bright and brief before she told me she would think about it and hung up to think about it somewhere other than with me. By Thursday, the guest list had settled into the shape I suspected it would take: an honest arc of friends, a sprinkling of cousins, one aunt who had always liked me but liked my mother more, and no formal confirmations from my parents or from Daniel, though I could feel them orbiting the plan the way children circle a pool while daring each other to jump, which is why I added one small refinement to the evening that served as both civility and lock: a slim pedestal table on the front porch with a box of place cards and a pen and a sign that invited each guest to write a single sentence they wish someone had said to them during a year when they were underestimated. The rule being that admission required the sentence be addressed to themselves and not to anyone else, because revenge at its most satisfying rarely announces itself as punishment. It arrives as a standard that the right people can meet without bruising and the wrong people cannot approach without tripping. The night of the dinner, the winter air had that dry, almost static crispness that makes light look braver, and inside the house the table waited with its quiet plates and a roast that made the entire first floor smell like a story that ends well. And one by one my guests appeared at the porch, wrote their lines, and crossed the threshold with the kind of relieved laughter that follows a shared secret. Yet at 7:40 a car I knew too well rolled to a stop by the curb and idled longer than courtesy allows, and after a pause the passenger door opened and my mother stepped out in a coat I recognized from her holiday photos, while my father hovered on the driver's side pretending to check his phone. And as they approached the pedestal I watched from the hallway, not as a daughter waiting for a verdict, but as a host prepared to keep a promise to herself, because the sign did not care about bloodlines and the lock did not tremble for anyone. And when my mother lifted the pen, hesitated, and then began to write, I felt my breath slow into something I could hold. She placed the card in the box and reached for the doorbell, and before the chime finished I opened the door to find her standing with her expression arranged for company, and my father at her shoulder with his mouth set in the stubborn line that has sold so many half-hearted apologies as wisdom. And when I glanced down at the box and then back at her, I saw something unfamiliar move across her face, a flicker like a bird deciding whether to take off, and she said quietly that she had answered the questions in the only way she could manage today, that the sentence on the card might not be enough, but it was honest, and that she would understand if I kept the invitation for another time. I did not rescue her, and I did not punish her. I simply asked whether she would like a glass of water, and when she nodded I stepped aside and let her cross the threshold while my father remained on the porch, pretending to study the wreath as if the shape of it could absolve him, and as the door eased Shut behind her, the code light on the lock returned to its steady glow, and the house exhaled, knowing that for once entry had been earned rather than assumed. The house, once a private refuge that answered only to my footsteps and the creak of its familiar hinge, felt like a stage that evening yet refused to surrender its calm. Because the guests who had crossed the threshold after pausing at the pedestal to write their single sentences understood, without coaching or speeches, that quiet can be generous when people are careful with it. And as the living room filled with the low murmur of friends catching up and cousins testing the weight of their chairs, my mother stood just inside the entry with the awkward poise of someone who has arrived a little underdressed to a gathering she did not organize. Her hands folded around the glass of water I had offered and her coat draped over her arm because she could not decide whether she meant to stay. And somewhere between the first poured wine and the second plate of olives, she finally exhaled a breath she must have been holding on the porch and asked, not with defiance, but with that quiet curiosity people use when the ground has moved beneath them, where the box of cards would go once everyone had arrived, which I took as permission to say that after dessert we would read a few aloud, without names, because sometimes the only way to hear yourself is through someone else's voice. In the kitchen, I ladled stew into deep bowls and watched steam ribbon into the light while the playlist wandered through songs I had loved when I was too broke to do anything on a Friday night but turn the volume down and dream. And when I carried the first tray to the table, my father's shadow crossed the frosted glass by the front door, that careful hesitation that announces a man rehearsing an entrance he has not earned, and a moment later the bell sounded with the polite confidence of someone accustomed to being admitted. Yet before I could move, my mother set her glass on the credenza with a small decisive click and said that she would get it, and I stood in the hallway, suddenly a spectator in my own foyer, while she opened the door and met him with the face she uses when doctors explain risks, composed and listening and unwilling to be charmed, and I heard her ask in a voice that did not tremble whether he had written his sentence, whether he had read the question slowly enough to hear the parts that sounded like him, and the silence that answered was longer than pride and shorter than courage before he said that he would rather talk inside where it was warm, at which point the hum of conversation behind me rose like a tide and my mother, still holding the door at her side, explained in words that matched mine though I had not given them to her that warmth without accountability feels like theft and that this threshold would not move for anyone tonight. He left without slamming the door, and for a long moment we listened to the car idle, that stubborn engine note that once signaled rescue and now sounded like a refusal to read the map. And when at last the taillights slipped away, my mother closed the door and turned the lock with a steady hand, then returned to the place card table and, with the concentration of a student rewriting an answer until it stops wobbling on the page, added 3 more words to the line she had already written, words I did not read because I had promised myself I would not force the process into proof, preferring the slower, heavier path of letting people choose who they will be while you choose whether to keep the door open. And together we carried bowls to the table and slid into the conversation as if we had rehearsed the choreography, which in a way we had, alphabet by alphabet, over years of asking for something simpler than love and rarer than flattery. Halfway through the meal, when the house felt like it had been mine for a century and like I had only just unlocked it for the first time, Daniel arrived with the swagger of a man who has always been forgiven on arrival, his knock cheerful and unnecessarily loud, followed immediately by his voice through the door explaining that traffic had been terrible and that he had brought a bottle he knew I would like, which made 3 guests laugh softly because they have been to my kitchen enough times to know what I actually drink, and when he saw through the glass that I was the one opening the door, he lifted the bottle high like a charm and asked whether we could skip the theatrics, because family should not need paperwork to share a meal. I looked at the bottle and then at his eyes, which were already scanning over my shoulder to catalog the faces inside and estimate the applause, and I told him, in a sentence that felt both brand new and older than our entire family tree, that a house learns its manners from its owner, and that mine had stopped letting in people who shouted from the driveway about how reasonable they were, and when I pointed to the pedestal he laughed, that practiced bark he uses when he senses a gatherer circling his authority. But he took the pen anyway and wrote something quick, and as he reached for the handle I glanced down and saw that he had offered a joke instead of a truth, a little flourish about being misunderstood that would have charmed our mother at a barbecue, but did not move the lock. He tried the handle, found it firm, and with an expression I recognized from childhood, the tight, thin-lipped resentment of a boy who cannot convert charm into access. He muttered that I was overreacting and that none of this would be necessary if I had simply told them about the house like a normal person, at which point I felt the old heat rise in my chest and then pass, leaving only a clean, cool space where certainty could live. And I explained, not for him but for the child I used to be, that secrets are not the same as privacy and that I had stopped handing over things I built to people who liked to rearrange them in front of an audience, and then I wished him a safe drive and closed the door with a softness that denied him the pleasure of a slam. Returning to the table in time to catch the tail end of a story about someone's promotion and someone else's garden, the ordinary woven back into the evening as if drama were no longer the central ingredient. After dessert I stood and thanked everyone for coming, not with a speech about survival, but with a toast to unglamorous persistence, and then I opened the box and read 3 sentences aloud in the even tone of a narrator who prefers to leave room for the listener. One about letting go of a role that felt like a costume somebody else had tightened, one about admitting that an apology can be an act rather than a sound, and one, written in a hand I knew and did not name, about learning to stop confusing criticism with care. While I read, my mother's shoulders settled into the shape of someone who has decided to be present, and when I placed the cards back into the box and slid it onto the mantel, I told the room, as if sharing a logistics note and not the heart of the plan, that anyone who had answered honestly would receive the new door code in the morning with a standing invitation for Sunday soup, and anyone who had not would receive a card with a time and a table at the coffee shop down the street where I would be happy to listen to anything they wanted to say, because entrances, like apologies, are stronger when they are earned. Years from now, when the questions about that Thanksgiving resurface at other tables and in other forms, some people will say I was cruel and some will say I was brave and most will say I was dramatic, because it is easier to name the volume than the boundary. And I will probably smile and change the subject, the way you do when you realize the argument has ended and the silence is the verdict. Yet there will remain a part of me that wonders what my mother finally wrote after those 3 additional words, what she was ready to admit, and what she still hoped would solve itself without being touched, and that unanswered question will be my peace rather than my torment. Because I have learned that you can love people while declining their invitations to return to the version of yourself they prefer. And you can build a house that welcomes them when they arrive on foot with the right sentence in their pocket, and keeps them in the yard when they arrive with a key they did not earn.